you have a podcasting website and you have a podcast and you want your podcast to appear on your podcasting website. So how do you go about doing that? Now, this is one of the biggest problems that a lot of beginner podcasters face because they want to embed their podcast on their website and they don't know how to do it. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to embed a podcast on your website. Hello, this is Dilip and welcome to my channel. This is the Podcasting University. I call it the TPU TV. This is where I share a lot of simple, practical and implementable podcasting tips. If you're new here, then you might want to consider subscribing to this channel and don't forget to hit the bell notification so that you stay updated with all of the latest videos I release. Embedding a podcast on your website. This isn't as difficult as it sounds, but a lot of people find a lot of difficulty embedding a podcast on their websites. Now, one of the biggest problems that a lot of people face is if they are moving their podcast from one podcast hosting to another. So you might be using the embed code that is being provided by your podcast host, but when you move from that particular host to another host, what happens is all of the previous episodes where you had used the embed code from your previous podcast host stops working. Those episodes don't play on your website. Then you have to go through the entire exercise of replacing all of that code with a new code. Is there a way you can avoid that? You can obviously avoid that. And in this video, I'm going to share with you a simple tip, a simple tool that can help prevent all of this unnecessary problem. And I'll show you how to go about embedding a podcast episode on your podcast website. If you're not aware of how to embed a podcast, then this will be helpful for you. And I'll also show you what that tool is and how to ensure that you don't have to do the entire rework of replacing the old codes if you happen to change your podcast host. So let's get onto my screen and see how it is done. Okay, so here I am on my podcast website. This is a website for my podcast, the Podcasting University. And you can see here, these are all of the posts that I usually create for every one of my episode. Let me first go about creating a new post, and then I'll show you how to go about embedding the podcast episode onto this post. Now, let me say I title this post. What I usually do is in my website, I usually publish a blog post that goes along with the podcast. So it is in the form of a blog. It is not usually in the form of conventional show notes. I write a complete blog post, but then I also mention about the things that I spoke about in the podcast episode, the resources that I spoke about, and all of those things. In addition to that, what I do is I embed the podcast episode on to this blog post. Now, if you want to embed your episode, there are two different ways that you could do it. One is you could use the code, the embed code that is provided to you by your podcast hosting company. Or there is a second option, which I'll be talking about in a little while from now, which basically is a solution to a common problem that people face when they are transitioning over from one podcast host to the others. So what usually happens is that the embed code that is given to you by your podcast host, the old podcast host, stops working when you switch over to a new podcast host. So to get over it, the second solution that I'll be showing you will work amazingly well, and you don't have to go through all of your old posts to change the embed code. So first of all, let me show you how to embed the podcast episode onto your blog post or your podcast website using the code that is provided by your hosting provider. Now, I host with Acast, so this is my latest episode. You can see here, this is the latest episode. So if I have to publish this podcast episode on my podcast website, all I have to do is go to this embed player here, and you can see here that it opens up an embedded audio player, which I can then customize whichever way I want. I can make it a slim player, a medium player, a large player, whichever way. So I'll keep it as a slim player. Then you can select the theme. It can be dark, light, or colors from the podcast cover. So if you want it to look similar to your branding colors, you can use this. But otherwise, I would prefer keeping it dark. So this is a color that it chooses. You can select the custom fonts, and there are some advanced options which basically is about hiding the follow link and all. So I won't do any of those things. All I do is just copy the embed code here. or the link has been copied to your clipboard. Now what I do is I'll go back to my podcast website, and on the editor I select the HTML, the custom HTML block, and I paste that code here. You can see here this basically uses an iframe. It's an iframe that embeds this podcast player. Now let us quickly save this and preview how this would look. So let us preview how this embedded player will look. You can see here, this is how the player will be there, and it'll have the play button, the share button, the follow button, and a link to Acast, which is basically to promote Acast. So this is how the player will look. Now, if I am hosting with, let me say, Anchor, which is now Spotify for podcasters. So I have this podcast that is hosted with Anchor, which is not this podcast is not live anymore. The last episode that is published was in 2019. So for this, what I do is I have these options here. You can see here there is a copy embed option here. All that you need to do is just click on that. You will see that the embed has been copied. Go back to the post, and similarly in the HTML, all that you need to do is just paste that code. You can see here that once again it is using an iframe to embed the podcast episode. So let's save this, and now look at how this player will look. You can see here how the player is looking for Anchor or Spotify for podcasters. Now that's how the embed player will look if you're hosted with Anchor. Now I have another podcast that is hosted with Bcast, which is our biggest podcast, almost about 215 episodes published with more than 3 million downloads. So here again, it is pretty much the same thing. I go to episodes, and in each of these episodes, I get an option of sharing the episode, and then you can see here is the embed code. All I need to do is just copy this, go back to my podcast website and paste it. And you can see here, once again, it is using the iframe to embed the podcast episode. Now let me show you how this looks in the preview tab. You can see here, this is how that particular embed looks. Now, in all of these cases, you would have noticed that everything uses the iframe. Now, this is one of the way of embedding your podcast episode onto your podcast website. Now, let me show you the other technique that I spoke to you about. Now, here what I use is I use a service called as Fusebox. Here I am on my Fusebox dashboard, and you can see here both of my podcasts are showing up here in the dashboard. You can create a free account with Fusebox. So I have a free account, but you can also upgrade to their starter plan. You get a free podcast hosting if you are upgrading, and also you get a lot of features, like for example the embedded episode will look very beautiful like this, and it's pretty simple. Now in Fusebox, wherever you are publishing your podcast, you can go about publishing it the same way. And once you've connected your podcast to Fusebox, you'll be able to find all of those episodes here in Fusebox under that particular podcast. Now let me pick the latest one. You can see here, this is the latest episode that I had published. Now I have the embed code here. When I click on embed, it gives me these two codes. The first one is the JavaScript and the second one is the iframe code. Now in this case, what I would usually do is I would use the JavaScript code because it's a dynamic code. I copy it and then I go back to my podcast website and I paste it here in the similar way that we were pasting the embed code for the rest of the cases as well. So I click on save draft, and now let's preview and see how this looks. You can see here, this is how the embedded player looks. Now this is a much cleaner and a very beautiful way of embedding your podcast episode. It looks very professional in comparison to a lot of the other codes that are provided by the podcast hosting companies. In addition to that, you also have the peace of mind that even if you are to switch from one podcast host to another, you won't face this problem of your embed codes not working or the player not playing your podcast episodes. Now, I'll leave a link to Fusebox in the description box below. You can go and try them out. I would recommend going with their starter plan. It's an amazing plan, and you also get free hosting. And on top of that, you also get a lot of feature rich embed code from Fusebox. So go give it a try. And if you have any questions about embedding your podcast on your website, you can drop them in the comments below and I will respond to all of that. So I hope that walkthrough was useful and you now have learned how to go about embedding your podcast on your podcast website, and also learned about this simple little tool that can save all of that unnecessary headache of replacing the codes if you happen to change your podcast host. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then I would love if you can hit the thumbs up button below, because that will help other people find this video and benefit from this video. And if you're new here, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification so that you stay updated with all of the latest videos that I release. I release a new video every Thursday, so don't forget to watch all of the latest videos that I release. That is all that I have for today's video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting discussion around podcasting. Until then, keep watching TPU TV and you all have a wonderful rest of the week. This is goodbye from Dilip.